can't just leave your
The
car
night my
plugged in all
charger went
day.
dead at 12:10 and then
Actually,
again
I
the next
can.
night.
It's
And
my
the next I
charger.
thought it was just bad luck, maybe a loose plug, or the universe reminding me to check my wiring. By the third night, when the little notice on my phone said, "Charging interrupted," and I walked outside to find a stranger's Tesla tucked into my outlet like it belonged there, I felt something tighten in my chest that wasn't just annoyance. It was the weird, slow burn of being taken for granted not by the world, not by traffic or weather, but by the people who were supposed to be our neighbors. My name's Alex Mercer. I live on a quiet cul-de-sac in a development that likes to call itself tight-knit. Most mornings you see the same faces getting kids into cars, waving as they leave. Our HOA is proud of our lawn lines, our paint palettes, the little rules that keep everything picture perfect. I used to like that. I used to think rules meant fairness. Then Linda Park moved in, and my whole little definition of fair started to wobble. Linda ran the HOA like she was running a social media account, polished, performative, always on. She gave speeches about community values, led fundraisers with perfect pies, but the minute you looked closer it was all posture. The first time I saw her plugged into my charger, she was humming, like a woman entitled to the sun, and when I asked her to move she smiled like she was doing me a favor. "Oh, Alex, it's just for a minute," she said, like a monarch borrowing a subject's horse. There's a particular kind of humiliation that chews at you when someone takes what's yours and treats it like a public utility. It's not the money though, sure. Electricity counts, it's the message. My space, my boundaries, my things, treated like suggestions. I told myself to be reasonable. I texted her once, twice. She replied with a flurry of virtue signaling. "We're so green, Alex." And then one morning she walked out of her house with a coffee in her hand and the same blank entitlement on her face, the charger still plugged in. That's where the story pivots, where I stop being the passive guy who hopes for better manners and become the person who decides to do something about it. Not something illegal, not something vindictive. I wanted proof. Proof would solve things the way paperwork solves arguments. Clean, irrefutable, boring to the melodrama people like Linda prefer. So I set up a monitored dummy, a deterrent. A recording thing, nothing sensitive, nothing that would teach anyone how to mess with power lines. It was a watchful thing, more witness than trap. I need to say that because there are lines I wouldn't cross, and this was one of them. The first night it worked like a slow, small victory. The camera caught the shadow of her car turning in, the figure of a woman who moved like she owned the night. She plugged in, smiled into the streetlights, and walked away without looking back. The feed recorded the time stamps, the faces, the stupid little rituals of entitlement, the way she'd pause to straighten her hair, the way she'd tuck her handbag like a flag. I didn't want to make her a villain in a fairy tale. I wanted to make her accountable. So I gathered the logs like evidence, like receipts. I showed them to Jen, my partner, who has this way of looking at me, not indulgent, not skeptical, just patient enough to know when I'm right. "You're not baiting her to catch her being bad," she said. "You're documenting what she already is." The documentation grew into a stack of late-night clips. Her, then her neighbor's kid's friend, then someone else with a key in their hand, and a look of relief like they'd won some small moral lottery. It was stupid enough to be funny, and petty enough to make you angry. On a Tuesday, when the Condo Association newsletter went out with a notice about conservation and community spirit, I printed the clips and felt them pulse in my palm like a beating argument. Confrontation was inevitable. Linda's first reply to my showing up at the HOA office with quiet, professional copies of the footage was laughter that landed like a slap. "You rigged something on my property," she said, a performance that flattened anyone in the room into the role of audience. She used legal words like defamation and harassment like a weapon. She had practiced the sound of being offended. When I told the HOA board what I had, timestamps, footage, a log of repeated offenses, there was a shuffle and a divide. Half the board wanted to handle it gently, half wanted the spectacle. And Linda doubled down. She started to make public examples of herself, a kind of performative martyrdom, where she played the persecuted homeowner and the persecutor all at once. She rallied allies with charm that smelled faintly of danger. One afternoon, a man I didn't know, broad shoulders, overconfident smile, demanded I take down the camera. He said things in a voice that tried to sound casual but had the weight of a threat. "You don't want trouble, Alex," he said, up close and too loud for a neighborly chat. The words were a test. My heart did this thing where it rearranged itself, And for a second, I thought about calling the police, about making it all louder. But I knew what would make it louder in the way Linda feared, a public reveal. So I did something that felt uncomfortably theatrical. I took the collected footage to an HOA meeting on a Thursday night. I chose my words like I was trying not to sound like I was trying to shame anyone, but I knew shaming was part of the mechanism. I set a projector up in the community hall, in that fluorescent light that makes everything look honest. I showed the clips. I showed timestamps. I let the cameras be the court in which the small injustices were judged. When Linda's face appeared on the screen, the room changed. There was a delicious, quiet hush, the kind you get when a string gets pulled and suddenly the whole scene shifts. People who had nodded at the lawn rules now watched a woman act like a public figure and private thief. The man who had threatened me sat in the back with his hands folded, his posture empty now that the spectacle was out in the light. Linda tried to speak, and in a voice that had been so practiced it had become a costume, she attempted to explain. "I thought it was communal," she said, the phrase dangling like a lifeline. What I remember most from that night is not the triumph so much as the strange thinning that happened in me. The way watching her on the screen felt like watching someone read from a script they couldn't remember. When the board voted not a dramatic, showy thing, but an official, paper-signed action, Linda's position was weakened. She was censured, and a committee was formed to clarify what belonged to whom. We rewrote a little of the playbook about chargers and common spaces. People clapped, because clapping is what you do when you want a tidy finish. But endings are rarely tidy. A week later, when I thought we'd patched the wound, Linda filed a complaint against me. She claimed invasion of privacy, harassment, all the words that have more teeth in courtrooms than in living rooms. The police came, polite and slow, and asked for the footage. I handed it over. I explained, calmly, that this was about repeated trespass, about the erosion of neighborhood norms by someone who wore righteousness like armor. They took statements. They filed a report. Nothing cinematic happened, no dramatic handcuffs, no instant justice, but paper did what paper does. It keeps a record, which sometimes, eventually, matters more than a speech. In the quiet after, life on the cul-de-sac returned to a brittle normal. Linda still walked her dog with the same practiced serenity, and sometimes she'd look at me in a way that suggested either regret or a new strategy. I don't live for revenge, and I don't relish watching people fall. My satisfaction came from something quieter, a sense that boundaries could be enforced without spectacle, that fairness could be recovered in a way that made the future slightly less arbitrary. There's a part of me that knows this is small comfort. The HOA still argues about paint swatches and whether the blue on one house is the same blue as the blue on another. Politics in miniature continue. But when Jen and I park our cars and walk to the mailbox, we walk a little freer, like the edges of our day have been reclaimed. When neighbors wave now, not because they're performing for Linda's camera, but because they actually see you, it feels like a tiny revolution. If there's a moral, it's a messy one. People who wield community authority can do tremendous good, and they can also weaponize niceness. Entitlement wears better on some people than others. It sits easier in a woman who has learned how to look like she's always right. And the most useful thing I discovered is that accountability doesn't have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes it's just being willing to look, to document, to show up in a way that insists the truth exists even when people prefer a different story. So I'll leave you with this. What would you do if someone treated your life like a public amenity? Would you let it slide, call a mediator, fight it in the open, or do something small and stubborn to make sure your boundaries meant something? Drop a comment and tell me how you would handle an HOA that confuses image with integrity. Were we right to bring this into the light? Or did we cross a line that makes you uncomfortable? Tell me which side of that line you stand on, because that's where the real conversation starts.